hotel room. This was a very curious situation because no one except Simpson, the airline pilot, and the two harbor patrolmen knew what was taking place. The room had even been thoroughly searched for hidden microphones. That is the way the story stood a few hours after Lieutenant Brown and Captain Davidson arrived in Tacoma. After asking Jackson and Richards a few questions, the two intelligence agents left, reluctant even to take any of the fragments. As some writers who have since written about this incident have said, Brown and Davidson seemed to be anxious to leave and afraid to touch the fragments of the UFO, as if they knew something more about them. The two officers went to McChord Air Force Base near Tacoma, where their B-25 was parked, held a conference with the intelligence officer at McChord, and took off for their home base, Hamilton. When they left McChord, they had a good idea as to the identity of the UFOs. Fortunately, they told the McChord intelligence officer what they had determined from their interview. In a few hours, the two officers were dead. The B-25 crashed near Kelso, Washington. The crew chief and a passenger had parachuted to safety. The newspapers hinted that the airplane was sabotaged and that it was carrying highly classified material. Authorities at McChord Air Force Base confirmed this latter point. The airplane was carrying classified material. In a few days, the newspaper publicity on the crash died down, and the Maury Island mystery was never publicly solved. Later reports say that the two harbor patrolmen mysteriously disappeared soon after the fatal crash. They should have disappeared into Puget Sound. The whole Maury Island mystery was a hoax. The first, possibly the second best, and the dirtiest hoax in the UFO history. One passage in the detailed official report of the Maury Island mystery says, both X and X, the two harbor patrolmen, admitted that the rock fragments had nothing to do with flying saucers. The whole thing was a hoax. They had sent in the rock fragments to a magazine publisher as a joke. One of the patrolmen wrote to the publisher stating that the rock could have been part of a flying saucer. He had said the rock came from a flying saucer because that's what the publisher wanted him to say. The publisher mentioned above, who one of the two hoaxers said wanted him to say that the rock fragments had come from a flying saucer, is the same one who paid the man I called Simpson $200 to investigate the case. The report goes on to explain more details of the incident. Neither one of the two men could ever produce the photos. They misplaced them, they said. One of them, I forget which, was the mysterious informer who called the newspapers to report the conversations that were going on in the hotel room. Jackson's mysterious visitor didn't exist. Neither of the men was a hull of beat-up old boats that they used to salvage floating lumber from Puget Sound. The airplane crash was one of those unfortunate things. An engine caught on fire, burned off, and just before the two pilots could get out, the wing and tail tore off, making it impossible for them to escape. The two dead officers from Hamilton Air Force Base smelled a hoax, accounting for their short interview and hesitancy in bothering to take the fragments. They confirmed their convictions when they talked to the intelligence officer at McChord. It had already been established, through an informer, that the fragments were what Brown and Davidson thought slag. The classified material on the B-25 was a file of reports the two officers offered to take back to Hamilton and had nothing to do with the Maury Island mystery, or better, the Maury Island hoax. Simpson and his airplane pilot friend weren't told about the hoax for one reason. As soon as it was discovered that they had been taken thoroughly and were not a party to the hoax, no one wanted to embarrass them. The majority of the writers of saucer lore have played this sighting to the hilt, pointing out as their main premise the fact that the story must be true because the government never openly exposed or prosecuted either of the two hoaxers. This is a logical premise, but a false one. The reason for the thorough investigation of the Maury Island hoax was that the government had thought seriously of prosecuting the men. At the last minute it was decided, after talking to the two men, that the hoax was a harmless joke that had mushroomed, and that the loss of 2 lives and a B-25 could not be directly blamed on the two men. The story wasn't even printed because at the time of the incident, even though in this case the press knew about it, the facts were classed as evidence. By the time the facts were released, they were yesterday's news. And nothing is deader than yesterday's news. As 1947 drew to a close, the Air Force's Project Sign had outgrown its initial panic and had settled down to a routine operation. Every intelligence report dealing with the Germans' World War II aeronautical research had been studied to find out if the Russians could have developed any of the late German designs into flying saucers. Aerodynamicists at ATIC and at Wright Field's Aircraft Laboratory computed the maximum performance that could be expected from the German designs. The designers of the aircraft themselves were contacted. Could the Russians develop a flying saucer from their designs? The answer was no. There was no conceivable way any aircraft could perform that would match the reported maneuvers of the UFOs. The Air Force's Aeromedical Laboratory concurred. If the aircraft could be built, the human body couldn't stand the violent maneuvers that were reported. The aircraft structures people seconded this. No material known could stand the loads of the reported maneuvers and heat of the high speeds. Still convinced that the UFOs were real objects, the people at ATIC began to change their thinking. Those who were convinced that the UFOs were of Soviet origin now began to eye outer space, not because there was any evidence that the UFOs did come from outer space, but because they were convinced that UFOs existed and only some unknown race with a highly developed slate of technology could build such vehicles. As far as the effect on the human body was concerned, why couldn't these people, whoever they might be, stand these horrible maneuver forces? Why judge them by earthly standards? I found a memo to this effect was in the old Project Sign files. Project Sign ended 1947 with a new problem. How do you collect interplanetary intelligence? During World War II, the organization that was ATIC's forerunner, the Air Materiel Command's secret T2, had developed highly effective means of wringing out every possible bit of information about the technical aspects of enemy aircraft. ATIC knew these methods, but how could this be applied to spaceships? The problem was tackled with organized confusion. If the confusion in the minds of Air Force people was organized, the confusion in the minds of the public was not. Publicized statements regarding the UFO were conflicting. A widely printed newspaper release, quoting an unnamed Air Force official in the Pentagon, said, "The flying saucers are one of 3 things: solar reflections on low-hanging clouds, small meteors that break up, their crystals catching the rays of the sun, icing conditions could have formed large hailstones, and they might have flattened out and glided." A follow-up, which quoted several scientists, said in essence that the unnamed Air Force official was crazy. Nobody even heard of crystallized meteors, or huge flat hailstones, and the solar reflection theory was absurd. Life, Time, Newsweek, and many other news magazines carried articles about the UFOs. Some were written with tongue-in-cheek, others were not. All the articles mentioned the Air Force's mass hysterical-induced hallucinations, but a Veterans Administration psychiatrist publicly poo-pooed this. "Too many people are seeing things," he said. It was widely suggested that all the UFOs were meteors. Two Chicago astronomers queered this. Dr. of Chicago Observatory was quoted as flatly saying the UFOs couldn't be meteors. "They are probably man-made," he told the Associated Press. Dr. Oliver Lee, director of Northwestern University's observatory, agreed with Dr. Kuiper, and he threw in an additional confusion factor that had been in the back of many people's minds. Maybe they were our own aircraft. The government had been denying that UFOs belonged to the U.S. from the first, but Dr. Vannevar Bush, the world-famous scientist, and Dr. Merle Tuve, inventor of the proximity fuse, added their weight. "Impossible," they said. All of this time, unnamed Air Force officials were disclaiming serious interest in the UFO subject. Yet every time a newspaper reporter went out to interview a person who had seen a UFO, intelligence agents had already been flown in, gotten the detailed story complete with sketches of the UFO, and sped back to their base to send the report to Project Sign. Many people had supposedly been warned not to talk too much. The Air Force was mighty interested in hallucinations. Thus, 1947 ended with various-sized question marks in the mind of the public. If you followed flying saucers closely, the question mark was big. If you just noted the UFO story titles in the papers, it was smaller. But it was there, and it was growing. Probably none of the people, military or civilian, who had made the public statements were at all qualified to do so. But they had done it. Their comments had been printed, and their comments had been read. Their comments formed the question mark. End of Chapter 2. Recording by Roger Moline. Chapter 3 of The Report on Unidentified Flying Objects. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Roger Moline. The Report on Unidentified Flying Objects by Edward Ruppelt. Chapter 3. The Classics. 1948 was only 1 hour and 25 minutes old when a gentleman from Abilene, Texas, made the first UFO report of the year. What he saw, a fan-shaped glow in the sky, was insignificant as far as UFO reports go, but it ushered in a year that was to bring feverish activity to Project Sign. With the Soviets practically eliminated as a UFO source, the idea of interplanetary spaceships was